let's first start talking about the impacts that we think we are going to have on our diagnostic teams. When we looked at this system in total and we assessed the impact on our diagnostic teams, I think we've been able to boil it down to what we think will be 3 primary changes. I'm going to lay them out for you here and then do a deeper dive on each of them in just a moment. So first and foremost, the changes for our diagnostic teams. Number 1, we're going to begin leveraging our risk assessment work to align our release conditions with assessed risk levels. So we're going to leverage risk assessment work to align release conditions with assessed risk. One of the questions that we get when we talk about this is, if that's what we're going to be doing, what in the world are we doing today? Aren't we already doing that? And the answer to that is somewhat yes, somewhat no. We have made a substantial investment in risk assessment in this agency, and that is something of which we should be tremendously proud. The work now becomes leveraging all of that work in the diagnostic phase and refining it into the PSR, but then also carrying it out into the phases of supervision, okay? So I'll talk about that in just a moment. We have been really good at doing our work with the risk assessment, but I think we have some space to grow in terms of translating that work into our supervision practices. What I mean by that is our supervision practices do not differentiate the way that we treat people based on their level of risk. So coming out of diagnostic, we know that someone is high risk for FTA or low risk for rearrest. But when we get them for supervision, we treat them essentially the same, irrespective of that initial risk level. Okay, so when we talk about aligning release conditions with assessed risk, it means that we're going to begin to match conditions to those very specific risk levels. We have a very formulaic approach that we use in MI 2202, and I will be, during today's presentation, talking about how we're going to deconstruct 2202 and make it better match what we're going to be moving towards in the future. One of the other questions that we received along this same point had to do with, are we going to be changing risk assessment? So when I say leveraging risk assessment, the question was, does this mean we're going to get a new risk assessment? The answer to that question is no. Our risk assessment is valid. We have been using it since late 2014. We had it revalidated in 2018. We put those changes into place during 2019, and we are now ready to take the next steps with respect to what we do with that risk assessment information. So we will not be changing the risk assessment tool that we utilize. Similarly, someone asked the question of whether doing this leveraging the risk assessment meant that we would start to assess risk multiple times during the life of a supervision case, right? So you all know now, we do one risk assessment at the beginning of supervision. And so the question came up around whether we're going to do a risk assessment multiple times. I see a few people in the audience already shaking their heads. No, that is correct. We will not be conducting a secondary risk assessment because of the way that our tool is structured. The way that our tool is structured, it examines what are called primarily static factors. Static factors are those that do not have a tendency to change when circumstances change. For us, much of our risk assessment calculation is driven by criminal history. And during the life of a case, someone's criminal history is not going to change. Many of the factors that we use are going to be the same for someone at the beginning of supervision as they are at the end, so there is no need currently to do what is called a dynamic risk assessment, which means you would do it at one point in time and then a later point in time. We tend to have people under supervision for about 100 days, and right now in that 100-day period, there's no need to reassess. So we will only be using the one assessment that we have, and we will only conduct that assessment one time only, okay? So I'll talk a little bit more when we get to that slide, but that's what we mean when we say we're going to leverage risk assessment work to align release conditions with assessed risk. The second change that's going to be experienced by our diagnostic teams is we are creating a two-dimensional matrix to facilitate alignment of those conditions with assessed risk. And then last, we're going to be refining the report as directed condition to provide greater detail at arraignment. So now let me unpack each of those in a way that it's a little more practical and provide some examples of what we're actually talking about. When we talk about leveraging risk assessment work to align conditions with assessed risk, the best way to demonstrate the change is to talk about our current practice and then contrast that with our future practice. Today in DC Superior Court, our current practice for release recommendations is that we provide in our PSR a composite list of recommendations that are based on the highest assessed risk level, either FTA or rearrest. So you all know our risk assessment model now generates 3 scores of risk. Global FTA, so how likely is it that someone is likely to fail to appear. Global rearrest, how likely is it that they're going to be rearrested on any charge. And then dangerous or violent rearrest, how likely is it that they're going to be rearrested on a charge that is dangerous or violent. We get those 3 scores, and they can be anywhere from high to low on those, very high to low on those. And what we do today is we merge all of that information together. We take those 3 scores and we look at them as one, and the highest score wins. And while that is one approach and it's been serving us well, we have the ability to treat them as the individual scores that they are, and that's what we're getting ready to do. For example, in today's world, if an individual is high risk for failure to appear, medium risk for rearrest, and maybe low risk for dangerous and violent rearrest, we still treat them as a high risk defendant because one of their scores was high risk. Does everybody understand that when I say that? That is not consistent with science. Science says if you've taken the time to get this very specific picture of the individual, act on what you learned. We basically spend this time to get this very prescriptive look at people during the diagnostic phase, and then we collapse it all back down for ease of supervision purposes. I think we can do better if we respond to the information that we actually have in front of us. So one of the biggest changes that you're going to see coming out of Diagnostic is today what we have simply is a listing of conditions that we're recommending to the court. You see it starts off with naming a supervision program that we're recommending for placement. So in this case, it was general supervision. Then we have reporting to PSA in person until otherwise directed. And then there's an address verification condition. These conditions are all of what we recommend to the court, but the court has no idea how these conditions map to the assessed risk. Going forward, what we're going to be able to do is to say, court, the person is low risk for rearrest, therefore this is all we're recommending with respect to rearrest conditions. The person is higher risk for FTA, so this is what pretrial would do with this individual to mitigate that risk. So the court will be very easily able to see how our recommendations are mapped specifically to what we've assessed in terms of risk. So I'm going to show you a snapshot of what the future practice will look like partially. We're already doing some of this work in U.S. District Court, so District Court is a little bit ahead of the curve in this regard. And what you see is that District Court still has a list of recommendations, but beneath here, they identify the individual scores for the domains that we're trying to control for, FTA and rearrest. On our final PSRs, both in District Court and in Superior Court, what will actually happen is this failure to appear risk will then have the conditions aligned beneath it, and this global rearrest will have the level and then the individual conditions aligned beneath it. Does that make sense? So they will be very specifically mapped to the risk that we are trying to control for. One of the things that every judge wants to see is the rationale for the recommendations that he or she is being asked to accept. And we think that we can make some additional headway in terms of convincing judges of the wisdom of our recommendations by tipping our hand a bit more and giving some detail around why we make the recommendations that we make. The other difference that you see is that there is no reference to a program, right? So remember on the first one it said general supervision program. There is no need to categorize someone into a program because what we are simply doing is supervising individuals based on the individual release conditions that we'll recommend. Program means that all of us who are in a program tend to get treated similarly, irrespective of risk. What we're moving to is where PSA will treat you individually based on the individual risk you present, any needs you may have, and craft a supervision strategy that is appropriate for you based on those factors, rather than lumping you in with other people who may not have the same risk level as you have, but we're still treating you the same today. Is everybody clear on that distinction? We often say that the basis for moving to risk-based supervision is that we're moving to different programs. That's what we mean when we say that. Programs basically mean you treat everyone in a program the same way. Risk-based supervision means you treat me as an individual based on my individual risk. Okay, so that's really the big difference that you'll see in diagnostics. So the first one being leveraging risk assessment work to align our release conditions with assessed risk. Let's move on to the second of the three. The second of the three, people say, well, that's great, that sounds great. You're going to individually align these release conditions with people's assessed risk. How in the world are you going to do that? This is the way that we are going to do that. We spent a ton of work during fiscal year 2019 researching best practices in the field of community corrections and more specifically pretrial supervision. And what we understand now is that because we are controlling for two different domains of risk, failure to appear and rearrest, we needed to consider each of those individually and figure out what PSA has in its toolkit to control for each of those risks. And what we ended up with is a matrix that has rearrest going down the side axis and failure to appear going across the top. And as you can see, it goes from low risk to very high, and then from left to right, low risk to very high. Which means that if an individual happens to be assessed and they're low risk for FTA and low risk for rearrest, they will be in this far upper left box. If conversely they are high risk for rearrest and high risk for FTA, they're going to be in your lower right portion of our matrix. And in the other 14 squares between there are every other combination of those two factors. What this essentially means is that we have taken the work to figure out what strategies PSA has available at its disposal to control for the independent domains of risk that are presented by every defendant that comes to us for assessment and or supervision. What I will say about this is that as you're looking at this video, we probably have not finalized this matrix. So do not be wed to what is in the boxes. I think we are very close, but again, we are still going, we still may undergo one final transition. So really just for concept, understand the way that this chart works is one axis is for FTA, one axis is for rearrest, and the conditions inside of there are what should be considered to be recommended for individuals who come out this way. Okay, let's go to the third. And the third and final change we think that's going to most impact our diagnostic officers has to do with refining of the report as directed condition. What we want to do is we're refining this report as directed condition to provide greater detail at the point of arraignment. Right now, we use a general condition that says report to PSA as directed. People who have been with the agency for a long time know that getting judges to accept this condition was somewhat of a fight, because what it meant was we were asking judges to trust us to change supervision requirements based on our judgment or based on our observations of defendant conduct. We were ultimately able to get judges to feel comfortable using this. The way that we're going to honor that level of trust that they have vested in us is by providing them with greater detail at the outset of what we're asking them to order. So instead of having the generic report to PSA as directed, we will continue in the future to use that as the beginning of the condition or the language that will appear on the PSR. But we will then be pairing it up with a very specific statement that follows thereafter. Report to PSA as directed, but the defendant's initial reporting schedule will be as follows. This way, if the judge orders this, when the individual leaves the courtroom, the judge is clear, the defendant is clear, their attorney is clear, the prosecutor is clear, and pretrial. All of us are clear about what the initial reporting schedule is for this defendant. Okay, so that's really the major change that we're talking about when we talk about refining report as directed to provide greater detail at arraignment. Okay, so those are the three primary pieces that we'll talk about when we're talking about changes to our diagnostic program. The reason why we are investing this heavily at our diagnostic phase is to address a concern nationally in pretrial, including PSA, which has to do with over-supervision and over-conditioning. And for those of you who are not aware of what that concept means, over-supervision and over-conditioning simply means that a pretrial services agency is asking a court to order more than what is necessary to reasonably assure appearance in court and to prevent rearrest. If someone were to candidly ask me whether I think our agency is guilty of that, I would have to candidly say that yes, we are. I don't think that it is as harmful here as it is in other jurisdictions, but I think that the risk is great enough that we should take some steps to try to improve it. The dangers that come along with over-supervision or over-conditioning are multiple. Let me just hit on three. First is that it wears out your workforce because you're asking your workers to do more than what is necessary to get to the outcomes that you're trying to control for. Second, it is not fair to the defendants and it actually violates the law. The law requires pretrial to recommend, and I hear it from the audience, the least restrictive conditions. When you think about the least restrictive, the law is basically asking us, what is the least that you need to do with this person to get them to show up in court every time they need to be here and to keep them from being rearrested? And if you're doing anything more than that, you're over-supervising, you're over-conditioning. And in many cases, we have that in our current supervision protocols. We're trying to get away from that. And the third thing that over-supervision and over-conditioning does is it decreases the defendant's likelihood of success. When you ask more of someone than what is required, by its very nature, you're setting the person up for failure. So you've got staff implications, you've got implications to the integrity of your system, and then you're just really setting people up for failure. So that's why we're really trying to get away from things that are unnecessary and only do that which is necessary in order to get to the success that we're trying to get to. I am going to pause here and take any questions that might be present because we're going to shift away from diagnostic and really start to talk a little bit more about supervision. Any questions from diagnostic? Hearing none, let's keep moving.